Hello, it's Matt McLaughlin, and thank you for joining me for a very special episode of the podcast. We've recently launched a brand new podcast series called BattleWalks, and as the name suggests, BattleWalks is all about getting out and exploring the great battlefields of Europe in a virtual sense. It's hosted by me and battlefield historian Peter Smith, and together we get out and walk the ground and tell the stories of the men who fought and died on some of the most famous battlefields in the world. We're going to explore battlefields from the First World War, from the Second World War, from ancient times, from all eras, and in all parts of Europe. It's going to be a really exciting series. So I wanted to bring you a bit of a preview, a bit of a bonus episode. So this is an episode we recorded recently on walking the battlefield of the Somme, one of the most famous battlefields from modern history. And I'd encourage you, if you enjoy this episode, to subscribe. Jump onto Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, wherever you find your podcast, wherever you're listening to this now, and look for BattleWalks and subscribe, because each week we're going to release a new battlefield walk, and we're just absolutely loving doing them. So enjoy this bonus episode of BattleWalks, and I'll talk to you soon.
A Living History production.
I'm Matt McLaughlin.
And I'm Pete Smith.
We're battlefield historians who love nothing better than getting out and walking the ground where great battles in history took place.
And now we'd like you to come with us. Every week, BattleWalks will take you to one of the great battlefields of Europe.
As we walk the ground, we'll dig through the pages of history, we'll uncover the secrets of the battlefields, and most importantly, we'll tell the stories of the people who fought and died there.
Welcome to BattleWalks.
Hello and welcome to BattleWalks. Thank you for joining us yet again to walk across some of the amazing battlefields of Europe. As always, I'm joined by my colleague and friend, Pete Smith. Pete, welcome back.
Hi, Matt. Yeah, good to be with you again.
Today, mate, we're heading to the Somme. We haven't done a walk in the Somme before. We're heading down to France, this most iconic battlefield. When we talk about the First World War, the Western Front, most people's minds wander immediately to the Battle of the Somme. And today we're going to explore a key part of that battlefield, aren't we?
Yeah, we are indeed. We're going to be looking at the 1st of July, one section of the battlefield from the 1st of July. And for the Brits, the 1st of July, the worst day in British military history, really kind of holds us. It holds us, and if anybody's even slightly interested in the Great War, then it's that date, the 1st of July, 1916. That's the date that keeps bringing you back.
Well, Pete, why don't we start by you giving us your very brief overview of just why this battle occurred and what happened on this iconic day of the 1st of July, 1916.
Okay, this is just a general overview. Britain joins the First World War. The British Army expected to be near to the coast. They expected, when the lines solidified, they expected to be near to the coast. It's a traditional area where Britain has always fought in France and Belgium. But that's not going to be the case. In 1915, really the French were under such terrible pressure at Verdun that there was a request, perhaps an order, depends how you view it, that Britain should take more of the line. In other words, we should extend our line away from the coast, across Flanders, the Flanders Plains, and up onto the ridges around Arras, and then over those ridges and onto the Somme. The reason for doing that is that's going to free up French troops to be dispatched to assist the French fighting around Verdun. And it's also, if we assault at these positions on the Somme ridges, then it's going to hold the German reserves here, or even better, it's going to cause Germans to be brought from Verdun across to here. So in other words, it's assisting the French. So the Battle of the Somme is really an attempt by us to aid the French at Verdun, and also to start a breakthrough. They're hoping that this is going to be a breakthrough as well. So if we're going to organise a diversionary attack, which is effectively, this is an enormous diversionary attack, then we might as well try and do more than that and break through. So that's just a general overview of why the Battle of the Somme takes place on the 1st of July in 1916. Of course, it's not just a one-day action. The battle itself is going to run from the 1st of July until the 18th of November. So it's an enormous, long battle. But we're interested today, we're going to be looking at the 1st of July.
And tell us just about how that battle went. Tell us about on the 1st of July, how it was supposed to go, what the plan was, and how that battle actually went on that morning.
Well, the battle itself, the 1st of July, we have objectives, and the objectives were not overly strenuous for the 1st of July, and it was hoped that we would break through the Germans, or the frontage. And the frontage is quite long. It's 23 kilometres, or quite wide, 23 kilometres of frontage. So it's not just in a small area, it's a big area, and there is a hopeful that we will get success. with minimal casualties. And the idea was to bombard the Germans, to drive them underground, to kill them, to smash the barbed wire, and then for us to walk across no man's land almost unassisted, because the Germans will all be dead or driven underground. And of course, that's not going to be the case. The Germans are in much deeper chambers underground than we expect. The barbed wire is thicker, we haven't got the right ammunition, and we haven't got the right tactics. We'll discuss perhaps some of the tactics as this story goes on, but what we really could have done with is a creeping barrage, one that protects the infantry as they're advancing. We haven't got that. We haven't yet got tanks. So this battle is really about what we haven't got, but we nearly have, because by the end of the Battle of the Somme, we are getting a lot of these things. So the first day, within the first hours, becomes a total disaster. The men cannot get across no man's land. It becomes a race. Can the Germans get up from underground, mount their machine guns, open fire before we can get to them? And the answer is yes, they can. And that's what happens. And so 60,000 casualties. A lot of those casualties in the first few hours of the battle. So truly appalling, and that is the worst 24 hours in British military history. So 60,000 casualties. Of those 60,000, about a third were killed outright. So it's a destructions of many of the battalions that were raised specifically for the First World War from volunteers. So these are the PALS battalions. And this is the battle of the PALS battalions, these volunteer soldiers who are here. The best, really, we'd have to say the PALS battalions are the best that Britain could offer at that period. No conscription yet, or the conscription has come in, but they're not yet reaching the front. So most of these men are volunteers, along with territorial soldiers and regular soldiers. But of course, the regular soldiers, and to a certain extent the territorials, have been doing their job up until this point in 1916, so they are very much denuded. Not that many regular soldiers still here on the front line.
It's just an appalling disaster that first day, and we should, as you mentioned before, we should point out that the Battle of the Somme went on for a very long time. And as we do more episodes of this podcast, we'll be revisiting the Somme and various actions involved in the later parts of the Battle of the Somme. But today we are going to talk about that first day, the famous first day on the Somme, the 1st of July 1916. And it's a very big area, so obviously we can't cover it in one bite. What small part of the battlefield are we looking at today, Pete?
Right, we're going to have a little bit of a look at the battlefield around an area called the Sunken Lane. Now, the first thing I need to do before I go any further is just explain what a sunken lane is. What is it? Well, it sounds like it's a lane that's sunk into the ground, and that's exactly what it is. The name really tells you. It's more interesting is how that occurs. What creates a sunken lane? Well, it's age, it's time, it's weathering, it's wear, carts going up and down it, and it's normally on a hill. You have to say most of the really deep sunken roads are on hills, and a sunken lane is created by carts going up and down. You can imagine the guys coming and levelling it when it gets rutted. They throw out the stuff to the side. Chalk, here it's a chalk landscape, so they're throwing out the chalk to the side, they're throwing out the mud to the sides, hence the banks go up with the stuff coming out of the lane, and the rain washes out the infill, and they'd have to scrape it out again and throw it to the sides, and so over centuries, literally, it sinks into the ground. So when anybody mentions the Sunken Lane and the First World War and the Battle of the Somme, to most Brits who have read, or to anybody that's read anything about the war, then it will take them to a place called Beaumont, Hamel. And so this is where, just outside of the small village of Beaumont, Hamel, in the Sunken Lane. Now, why it's really, really famous is because it was filmed at the time by a gentleman called Malins, who was the official cinematographer for the Battle of the Somme. So you have to say, well, that's odd. Well, it wasn't really, because the Battle of the Somme was hoping, it was hoped by the military and even by the public who were aware of it, the great push, that we were going to walk over the Germans. So they thought, well, we need to film this. This will make a great propaganda film. That's what it is, a propaganda film. So they're going to film it, and Malins is the official cameraman. And this is one of the shots he did was looking down the sunken lane. So that's really why we're going to start in this sunken lane.
And who were the troops that were attacking in this area on the 1st of July?
Right, well, what we've got is he's actually filming the 1st Battalion of the Lancashire Fusiliers. So this is a regular battalion, so these men will have seen action elsewhere, probably a lot of action, but there'll be an awful lot of volunteers now who have joined them. It's a terrible piece of image. There's a lot of stills taken from the footage, but in my view, Malins filming down the sunken lane on that morning, and it's about 20 minutes, half an hour before the whistles blew at 7:30 in the morning. So it's filming them waiting to go over the top. The sunken lane is actually in no man's land. It's in front of our frontline positions. We sapped out to the sunken lane. What's a sap? A sap is a trench that runs towards the enemy. So from our front line, we sapped out into the sunken lane, and it gave us an advantage. There, a good quarter of the way, probably a little bit more, across no man's land in the sunken lane, waiting for the whistles to blow at 7:15. And Malins is there to film the detonation of a mine. But before he films that, and we're going to talk about the very famous Hawthorn mine, which creates the Hawthorn crater. He's going to film the infantry before that mine detonates. And so this is what he's doing. It's a misty morning, so that's the other thing we have to think about. It's misty, it's daylight, it's the middle of summer, so it's warm, and we've got a ground mist that's billowing around. Now that aids him enormously. If you're carrying a mahogany camera with glass plates and a tripod, and you've got to get it into a position to actually film a battle, well, A, you're going to get yourself killed, and B, it's difficult. But he, in the mist, manages to get across into the sunken lane and to film these guys before they go over the top. And it is a truly just so moving bit of footage, because these men, this is going to be a disaster. These men are going to go over the top, and they're going to be gunned down almost as they climb out of their sunken lane. And so looking at them, you can see that they're probably a little aware of what is the possibility that's going to happen to them. So they're not keen to be filmed. They're fiddling with their buttons. They're checking their bayonets are fitted properly. They're kind of scowling at the camera. And some work was done a few years ago now for a documentary and then a book about this Malins and his film work. And they brought in a lip reader to have a look at what the guys were saying, because they're obviously speaking as they're looking at the camera. The guy that was brought in to lip read, he couldn't read it. He couldn't tell what they were saying, and they realised that they had very strong northern accents from the Lancashire mill towns, and so they had to basically send him away to go and learn the accent, and then come back and try and lip read again. And he was able to lip read. And what he discovered, in the main, it's profanities. These guys do not want to be filmed. They are looking up at him and saying, "On your bike, I don't want you here. I don't want you filming me at the moment. This is not a good thing to film. I'm terrified. I'm nervous. I'm trying to kind of get used to what's going to happen. And the guy's trying to film me." So to my mind, it's a terribly moving section of film of the guys in the sunken lane. And that mist behind them, which enabled him to get his camera out there, it gives it almost a surreal quality. Here they are in their black and white, standing out with the mist behind them, looking down the sunken lane and along out into no man's land.
It's well said, Pete. And the thing I always say when I visit a battlefield and explore fighting and warfare is that being in an army, being in a war, is about losing your sense of individuality. That even when we look back on it now through the pages of history, we think about large formations of men. We think about them fairly two-dimensionally. Footage like the Malins footage in the sunken lane blows that apart. You see these men as individuals. You see them talking. You see what they're doing in the moments before an attack. Effectively ordinary moments, what men would be doing today, what they've done throughout the centuries before they've gone into an attack. And as you say, knowing that so many of them would be gunned down as they left that sunken road. It's just extraordinary footage.
I think it's extraordinary as well, because even in modern times, you don't get that very often. You do not get a cameraman in the right place, if that is the right place, to film a group of men who are basically going to die in the few minutes after he's filmed it. And you don't see that very often, even today. So it's unusual, for over 100 years ago, for a cameraman with a mahogany cased camera, and glass plates for his stills to be able to film it and hand crank that camera there. Extraordinary.
And how many of the men were killed or wounded in that attack that took place very shortly after that footage was filmed?
486 of the men from the battalion were actually killed. 1,000 men in the battalion, but there's never 1,000 men go into the attack. So probably only 800, perhaps even slightly less, went into the attack. So it's an enormous number of men were killed in that attack from that battalion.
So Pete, we're standing now in the sunken road. If we followed in the footsteps of those men and climbed up out of the sunken road, what are we seeing as we look across the fields?
It's a very moving thing to do, and with groups where I always do that. You can actually climb up through the bushes and the undergrowth up onto the ridge, and in the mist, if you get it right, looking across, you've got an open landscape and then a wood on the other side, and that German position in that wood is known as the Bergwerk. And the Germans were waiting with their machine guns across there. And if you then start to walk across the field, and interestingly, that field very often hasn't got crops in it. They just started putting a few more trees in, which I'm a bit disappointed about because it's going to spoil that immediate feel of standing up and being able to look right across to the German lines. And it's probably, 200 metres, no more. And in between those two positions, the only thing that you can now see that interrupts that general flow, if you were to walk all the way to the German positions, which of course nobody did, nobody got into the German positions here, there is now a little cemetery in the middle. But it's exceedingly moving to stand up and to look across towards the German lines and the tree line, which marks very clearly, because that tree line gives you an immediate identification of where the German front line was.
Well, leaving the Sunken Road now, we're going to walk further along it, and we're going to come to a memorial, and it's quite a spectacular memorial. Tell us all about this memorial at the end of the Sunken Lane.
Yeah, this memorial is to the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders, and more particularly the 8th Battalion, the 1st of the 8th Battalion. It's a beautiful, enormous memorial, massively enhanced in recent years because it was getting enclosed by trees that went all the way around it. They've cleared those trees. A lot of work's been done in this area recently, and it gives it's been cleaned up, a beautiful, beautiful Celtic cross, enormous Celtic cross, emblazoned with all of the battle honours of the battalion throughout the whole of the war. This is where they commemorate their service during the Great War here at the Sunken Lane at Beaumont, Hamel. Now, interestingly, they're not commemorating the 1st of July because that is not when they were here. They were actually here in the November, in the final push to take this area, 13th of November, and so it's commemorating their success in the Highland Division. They fought here in the 51st Division, the Highland Division, and so this is where they decided that was the best place to place their memorial to commemorate their service during the Great War. So it's a beautiful memorial and well worth spending some time to have a look at.
It's one of the highlights I found the first time I walked the Somme is these divisional memorials or these battalion memorials that just spring up at these various places around the battlefield. And you know that something important occurred there wherever you see one of these memorials because the units involved placed them there to commemorate their service, didn't they?
They did indeed, and this one was inaugurated in 1924. So it's one of the early memorials to be built, and is actually looked after by the Commonwealth War Graves. There's this big kind of, it's difficult. I don't understand quite how this happens, but some memorials are looked after by the Commonwealth War Graves, others are looked after by the communes or by the associations that built the memorials. But in this case, because it was built in 1924, then it is looked after by the Commonwealth War Graves, and it is superb. It's kept in fantastic condition. The lawns around it are beautifully manicured. And it's always well worth climbing up onto the memorial, to the plinth of the memorial, out of the Sunken Lane. Because if you look behind it, that is where it's 300 or 400 metres, but is where Malins is going to move later on when he films the detonation of the mine, and we'll come back to that. But so it's always worthwhile climbing up to the memorial and looking behind you back towards our lines, so back towards the British front line, remembering that the Sunken Lane is in no man's land, and you'll get an idea of where Malins moved to. So after being in the Sunken Lane, he moves across to film the detonation at the start of the battle.
And moving on from the memorial, we come to a cemetery. Tell us about the Beaumont Hamel British Cemetery.
Yeah, well, Beaumont Hamel British Cemetery is the one that I described as you climb out of the Sunken Lane and look towards the German lines. Then it is a very thin strip cemetery, so only 2 rows of graves. And it's called Beaumont Hamel British Cemetery, which is a sensible name for it. Just as a matter of interest, the naming of the cemeteries was arbitrary. There is no set-down routine that all the cemeteries are named after the nearest village or the battle. It's arbitrary. It is effectively the guy that kind of sticks the marker and says we're going to build a cemetery here. Then he's the one that gets to name it, and very often the names remained. And in this case, Beaumont Hamel British Cemetery is what it is. The British part, just as a matter of interest, it just means that it's not German, it's not Belgian, it's not French. It is a British cemetery. But for Britain, you have to read to a certain extent the whole of the Commonwealth, the Empire. So it's only a small cemetery. It's 179 burials in these two parallel lines. Of that 179, 82 of them are unknown, so we don't know who they are. And just as a matter of interest, it doesn't just include guys. You imagine it'd be full of guys of the Lancashire Fusiliers who had been killed during that attack as they tried to cross over this landscape. But that's not the case. There are only 38 men that are buried in there who were killed on the 1st of July. Because it's a concentration cemetery. It's going to be created after the Germans withdraw back to the Hindenburg Line. So it's really can only be created in early 1917 when they can gather up the men from that area and bury them in this cemetery. A beautiful little cemetery, and it's just works very well because it takes you that little bit further into no man's land and it gives you that little bit of an extra view towards the German frontline positions.
The fact that it's a long and skinny cemetery, does that indicate that these men were buried in long trenches when they were brought in?
Yeah, I think it's quite likely. Again, they're quite close together. They're not touching, so it's not. Sometimes we don't know. There's no way we can actually know exactly how the men were buried, and you get clues by looking at the headstones. And as we've said in the previous podcast, that touching headstones normally indicates a trench burial. These are not actually touching; they're side by side. But what may not be the case. The men may not be directly beneath them here. We're not quite sure. One of the reasons why we're not sure is because this cemetery was very badly damaged in 1918 during the German Spring Offensive. They overran this area again, so we know it was damaged. So we're not quite so sure exactly where the men are, but I just presume that they're below their markers, but they may be a little away from their markers here.
And now leaving the cemetery, Pete, what's the next destination on our tour?
Well, we're just going to walk up back onto the road that runs following the attack, and we're walking towards Beaumont, Hamel, the village itself. So we're going to go past the German front line, or in fact over the German front line. Now there's a wood on the left-hand side, the one that I've been mentioning, that marks the front line, and there is some hope that in the near future some of that wood may be cleared, because there are the remnants of German trenches in there. At the moment, we can't go into it, and it's very overgrown, so it would be very difficult to get into it full stop. But there is a hope that perhaps in the future we may see a little more of that. And then we're just going to walk into the outskirts of the town before turning around and coming back up to a flagpole. And so you're thinking, a flagpole? But the flagpole is commemorating the 51st Division and its battle to get through here in the November. So on the 13th of November, as we know, they successfully took Beaumont Hamel and they put up a flagpole. Seems an odd thing to put up. It's recently been renovated. On the 90th anniversary, it was renovated in the November. I was there for the unveiling of the new flagpole, if you can unveil a flagpole. And and so there it is, just commemorating the service of the 51st Division fighting in the village. So it's nice. I love these little tiny small memorials, and they're everywhere. And a lot of people miss them. You can drive past a flagpole without even stopping and noticing that it's there. Thankfully now, on that 90th anniversary, they actually put up an explanatory panel, so there's a little bit more to catch your eye. But in the old days, it was just a flagpole. And for most of us visiting the battlefields, you're going from A to B, and you know where you're going to, you probably wouldn't have even noticed it. But it's a nice little addition to the battlefield.
Pete, one thing that strikes me as you're describing these memorials is that there seem to be a lot of memorials to the November battles on the Somme, which is when victory was achieved effectively, when the battle ended and when they captured the ground that they'd failed so spectacularly to capture in the earlier parts of the battle. Is that the way the Somme battlefields tend to be commemorated? It's the same as Hamel, for example. Hamel, the famous Australian battlefield that we discussed in an earlier podcast, does not get a lot of commemoration because it was such a disaster. And units that fought there tended to focus more on their successes later in the war or later in 1916. Is it the same on the Somme? Are there a number of memorials to the 1st of July fighting, or does it all tend to be from later in the campaign?
That's a very good question, Matt, actually, and it's one I had to just while you were talking, I was having a think about it. No, I think there are probably more memorials to the 1st of July. It's a kind of an Anglo-Saxon trait, isn't it? We like to commemorate a disaster. So, yes, there are memorials to successful actions or to the later actions, but I think they will be outnumbered considerably by memorials commemorating the disasters of the 1st of July, regiments that had terrible, terrible disasters. I was actually involved in the raising of a memorial to the Dorset Regiment, which had terrible disasters or terrible casualties, should I say, on the 1st of July. And that memorial was placed where those casualties took place, as near as we could get it, to where that happened, very close to Teepval. The Teepval Ridge and the Teepval Memorial, enormous memorial to the missing. So I think we're still raising them. We're still putting them in now. But I have this. I think it's fairly obvious that we do tend to place them where there were terrible casualties. Of course, terrible casualties are not a good thing to commemorate. But wherever you have terrible casualties, there's always enormous bravery. And I think that's what we're commemorating. We're not commemorating the disaster. We're not really commemorating the terrible casualties. We're commemorating the grit of the men that fought there and the limited success that they may or may not have had, but under terrible circumstances.
So, leaving the flagpole, we're now going to visit one of the most important and iconic sites, probably on the entire Somme battlefield. What is this huge hole in the ground as we approach it, Pete?
Yeah, it's extraordinary. We have to leave the road, climb up a new track that's been, in the old days, you kind of climbed over a farmer's fence and wandered across his paddock. Now it's very well organised, and we can walk up a trail that takes us to the Hawthorn Ridge mine crater. It's a double crater, interestingly, so it wasn't popular to visit for many, many years. It was difficult to visit. It had trees in it. You couldn't really see what was going on. And so people didn't make the effort to go and have a look. But recently a society has leased it. They've got I think it's a 90-year lease on it. And you can now, they've created a footpath. You can go up to it. They've cleared some of the trees. And we can now clearly see this double crater because it was blown on the 1st of July, but it was also blown on the 13th of November. So we've got two craters side by side. The stunning part of all of this is Malins. Geoffrey Malins, he had moved back, as I described earlier, behind the memorial to the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders, into a viewpoint where he could look across no man's land obliquely, and he was ready for the detonation of the mine. It blew 10 minutes before 7:30, and an odd time. There's been lots of debate over the years as to why and should it have been blown at that time. It's a discussion between two senior officers who can't quite make their mind up as to when it should be blown, but it's blown 10 minutes early. Now, actually, it didn't help in a way. It killed an awful lot of Germans, as you'd expect, when it detonated. But that 10 minutes enabled the Germans to bring up reinforcements, to bring up new sets of guns, and to cover the hole in their line that had been created because it blows right underneath a fairly prominent machine gun position that covers the valley and the landscape in front of it. So it was a good position that the Germans had created this nest of machine guns. Destroyed but reinforced by these new guns, and so we didn't have any success here. This is a story of total lack of success. Anyway, back to the crater. So looking down into the crater, extraordinary. We can now walk down into it. We can have a wander about. There are just one or two panels describing what you're looking at. Now, I think that's a good thing because I think you can overdo it. You can put too many things in that tell people what's going on, and in fact, eventually they interfere with our view and our ability to kind of to imagine if there are all of these things to read. So they're putting limited panels in describing what's going on, and the rest of it is up to you to use your imagination. It's very easy to get the gist of where the Germans are because of that line of trees to our right as we're looking towards the British lines, and we can see clearly the sunken lane where we were earlier, and across to the British front line. So that's exactly what the Germans wanted. They wanted that view, and we have it as well. And in fact, we have a slightly better view because in detonating these two mines, it's giving you a little bit more of a lip, and so we get a better view across no man's land. So it's a fantastic thing to go and have a look at. I would highly recommend that anybody who wants to follow in our footsteps then go and have a look at the mine, the Hawthorn Ridge mine craters. Fantastic.
Pete, we're going to talk about these great mine craters that remain on the Western Front in future walks, but this is probably an opportune moment, since it's our first encounter with one, to just talk about this whole aspect of warfare and something that I think people who talk about the First World War will find quite extraordinary if they don't know the story. Tell us about the tunnellers and the creation of these mines under front lines.
Well, we need to go back into almost a prehistory to have a think about castles and keeps and fortifications. How do you take, let's think of a walled castle, a big walled castle. How do you take it? Well, one of the things that you can do is try firing projectiles at it, whether it be by catapult or cannon. But another method is to go underneath it, is to start a tunnel. And it's where the term sapping comes in from. And of course, the rank of an engineer, a private in the engineers, is a sapper. So they would sap towards the castle. They would then eventually go underground because it was safer to go underground. Your enemy doesn't know quite where you've gone, and he can't hit you with arrows or spears. And they would basically take out the foundations of the keep in the castle, put in pit props to hold it up, then set a fire. That fire would burn out all the props at the same time, and having taken the foundations out, the keep would then fall over and you had a breach in the walls. So if we then go to modern times, or to the Great War, German trenches, what's the way of getting rid of a German fortification if you're about to assault? Same thing. But slightly different, because we now have gunpowder and explosives and amatol. And so what we're going to do is tunnel beneath the German position, a suitable position. We're going to create a void, and we're going to fill it with explosives. In this case, it was over 40,000 pounds of explosives, of aminol, that was placed there. So enormous amount of explosives, and we're going to detonate it. Sounds easy. Well, of course, the Germans are not stupid. The Germans know what we're going to attempt. So there is countermining constantly going on, trying to intercept our shafts as we're trying to get underneath the German positions. So it's a part of the war that for many, many years was almost forgotten, that this had been going on, all of these engineers, these tunnelers, these miners on both sides working and countermining and blowing something called a camouflage to try and destroy your enemy's shafts, their mines. So it was an extraordinary war, almost forgotten, and this is part of it. This is one that was successfully driven under the German positions, but not blown at the right time. But it was a success in that way, and it's a part of the war that will carry on right until we get back into a war of movement. It only works while we've got static lines, of course. In a war of movement, no point in tunnelling. But it's extraordinary.
And as you say, this is a double mine, was blown again in the November attacks, indicating that the first one had gone pretty wrong, because the fact that by the time they came back in November, they needed to blow up the German positions yet again. So the Germans were obviously still holding these very strong positions.
Yeah, completely. The whole attack was a disaster in this area, and in fact, Malins is going to film some of this as well. And I'll come back to that in a second, because he films the men in the Sunken Road, he films the detonation of the mine, and then he films part of the infantry attack, which is extraordinary in this area as well. But it's going to be a complete disaster. No success here whatsoever. Effectively, we have a good marker that tells us where we get a success and where we don't, and that is the main road that is running between Albert and a place called Bapaume. And in very central, in the middle of that road, is the town of Poitiers, very much an Australian battlefield. So that is marking the central axis of the assault. If you imagine Poitiers and that main road, to the left of it, looking from our perspective, looking towards the German lines, to the left of it, everything goes very, very badly wrong. To the right of it, we get limited success, and limited success leads to more success, and so we get a movement. But on the left, and we are very firmly on the left-hand side of the battlefield, no success at all. Just nothing went well here at all. Nothing went right. And any limited success that we did have was then literally stifled, because the Germans could transfer men around, because they'd already stopped the British attacks in that area. And in fact, the only success that takes place in that area that was successful to a degree where they got into the German lines and held them were the Irish, the Northern Irish, fighting at the Ulster Tower. So the Ulster Tower now being a memorial to them. So it's a memorial to the Ulstermen fighting there. And that is really the only success on this side of the battlefield. There was very little else that went well.
Well, it's such a remarkable spot. It's wonderful that the mine crater has been preserved. It's wonderful the work the association is currently doing to make it accessible to people, because now, for the first time in a very long time, really since the war, you can now go and walk and explore that crater and walk down into the bottom of it. And unlike the other great crater on the Somme, which is Lochnagar crater over near La Boisselle, it's completely inaccessible. You can't walk into the crater. You absolutely can in Hawthorn Ridge, and I find it a lot more moving. It's still quite wooded. There's still a lot of trees in there, And the first time I went there on a misty November morning, it was very moving indeed to stand in the bottom of that crater.
Yeah, I agree entirely, and it's ongoing. The enhancement of it is ongoing, but without interfering with it. And I think it's the same association, which is looking at the wood opposite, and hopefully that we will have access into some of that in the future as well, so we can link that into the German lines on the other side of the road, and that will enhance it even further. There's also work being done from an archaeological point of view, so it's very good. It's excellent, it's a great new site to visit, even if you've been before to the Western Front and to the Somme battlefields. If you haven't been to the Hawthorn Ridge crater, then make sure you do. It's great.
Take us to our next extraordinary site, Pete, after we leave the Hawthorn Ridge crater.
Well, this is even better, really. There's a little cemetery that's beyond the Hawthorn Ridge, so we're heading, kind of climbing uphill slightly and heading towards the memorial park for the Newfoundlanders, Newfoundland Memorial Park at Beaumont, Hamel. We can't get into it from this direction, but in between us at the crater and the memorial park, then we have another little cemetery called Hawthorn Ridge Cemetery Number 1. Now, that was always an awkward cemetery to get to because there wasn't a laid down path. There is no path to get to it. You had to literally, and when the crops are in, the farmer very often would plough up any kind of footprints or route that people were using. And I remember the very first time I visited it, I went round and round and attacked it from different directions and thought, well, I don't know how you're supposed to get to this cemetery. And you have to eventually walk through the farmer's crops. There was no other way to get to it. So very odd. One of the few that had no recognised path to get to it. Well, in creating this new way of exploring the Hawthorn Ridge mine crater, they've now linked it. So you can go from the Hawthorn crater, you can now walk through to the cemetery. So it's great. It's another addition. And what makes it even more moving, many of the men that are buried in the cemetery are those that were trying to take the crater on the 1st of July. So it's a beautiful little cemetery, 150 burials within the cemetery. What I haven't mentioned, actually, is all of these numbers, normally over 100 for the cemeteries, they have to be, because if the cemetery gets to less than 40, the French and the Belgian governments have decided that the cemeteries could not remain. They have to be above 40 burials to remain. So here we have 150. 67 of those 150 are unknown. And again, that's a fairly kind of... The proportion during the Battle of the Somme of people that are recovered unknown is quite high. It's not as high as when we will visit and talk about the burials at Passchendaele, but it's still quite high, and that is because a lot of these guys laid out for a long time. It was not easy to get to their bodies. Because these attacks were unsuccessful, it meant we couldn't get the bodies in. We couldn't rescue but we couldn't recover the remains of the men who had been killed. So it takes some time to get to the bodies, and in that period, then a lot of them have lost their identities. So we have 67 unknown here. I think it's perhaps one of the most moving sites because of the 16th Battalion of the Middlesex Regiment, which was known as the Public Schools Battalion. And there's quite a few of them buried in this cemetery. So what were the Public Schools Battalion? Well, this was a battalion of men who'd all been to public school. So you have to say, hang on a minute, these are the guys that are well educated. The public school system in Britain means it's a private school. You have to pay for it. So this is the future officers of the British Army fighting in a battalion of future officers, and that's where you have to look at it. So it's a very odd setup. So these are all men who went to privately educated, joined a battalion, the 16th Battalion of the Middlesex Regiment, and this is where they attack. This is their first attack. It struck 524 casualties. So again, you're looking at almost, if you're only attacking with 800, it's most of the battalion became a casualty. I had a very moving tour a few years ago where I took a group of men who had been to a public school around the battlefield, and they wanted to follow in a certain soldier's footsteps who'd been very badly wounded during the fighting. And so obviously one of my first questions was, why are we following this guy, and what is he to all of you gentlemen? And it's because he was their Latin master and their swimming coach when they were young men. And all they could remember of him, really, that horrified them as young boys, was that he had a terribly scarred back. And that was because, of course, he'd been very badly wounded with the battalion here. He'd lain out in no man's land for 8 hours before a stretcher team managed to get to him in the dark and bring him in. And so that's why we were there. And I found it very moving that they were commemorating and celebrating a man that was long since dead, but they remembered him because of his scarred back and teaching them to swim at a public school. So it's a beautiful little cemetery, laid out with a little rubble wall around it and a couple of trees and just a few lines. Again, a clue to the burials here is a lot of the graves are multiple burials. So in other words, there's more than one man in each grave, and that's normally a sign that they've been cleared from the battlefield and buried here. And of course, we know they had to be, because this was not taken until the November, and it still wasn't safe until the following year. So this cemetery, again, could not be created until the Germans started withdrawing back to the Hindenburg Line. We have a chap here, I've got a little quote about a chap called Private Derek McCulloch, and this is it's terrible, really. It's just to show you the type of wounds, really, and the experience. He had his right eye shot away, and soon afterwards he was hit by shrapnel. My collarbone, this is his quote, my collarbone, shoulder blade and 2 ribs were broken, and I had a bullet in my left lung. I managed to crawl back to our lines. So I think it's just extraordinary that a man can be so kind of hit by machine gun fire, because this is what this is here. It is predominantly the machine gun fire, but he still knew that the only way he was going to survive really was getting back to his front line. He went on to have a full and unsuccessful life, but very badly shot up in the middle of no man's land.
And this, I remember from visiting this cemetery that there's also there's a private headstone here. There's more than just the Commonwealth War Graves cemetery markers here, aren't there?
Yeah, it's one of the odder aspects of exploring the cemeteries of the First World War is you have to think about when were the decisions made to have a headstone that every single headstone looks the same. Well, it was made fairly quickly after the end of the war, but not quick enough in some ways, because very often men, and certainly the friends of men who were killed, clubbed together to ensure that they had something better than the standard wooden cross that was going to be put above your grave. And in this case, it was a plaque. It's a plaque, and it's actually from the family. They had organised it immediately after the war, or perhaps even during the war, when they were told where he was buried. And certainly there were companies in Amiens who were making these marble headstones and marble plaques to either be screwed to the wooden crosses or to be put instead of the wooden crosses. So when the Commonwealth War Graves, or the Imperial War Graves as it was, decided that everybody had to have the same headstone, they then had a problem. What do we do with these memorials that have already been paid for and put up on the graves of soldiers who died during the fighting? And it was decided that they could remain. I think it's the right decision to make. They felt that they would try and put up a Commonwealth War Graves headstone, and then their private memorial, their private headstone would also exist. If they couldn't, then they allowed the big original one to remain. And so there are several cemeteries where there is no Commonwealth War Graves headstone. There is just this private memorial, big headstone. In this case, it was decided that the small marble memorial, which had been screwed onto the cross, I suspect, could be allowed to remain, and so it's still there. So we have a private memorial sitting alongside a Commonwealth War Graves memorial. I haven't mentioned his name, but he was a Second Lieutenant E.R. Heaton. He's the guy that's got the private memorial. You'll spot it straight away as you walk through the gate. It's on your left-hand side, so it's very obvious. As you can imagine, these things stand out because they're not the headstones that we're used to seeing.
Well, this cemetery, Pete, is a beautiful spot to end the tour, but there's actually a slight bonus visit we're going to make. Only if, as we've said in previous podcasts, if there's no crops in the field. This is not possible to do if there are crops in the field, because the farmer will not take kindly to tourists trampling his carefully ploughed crops. But if there's no crops in the field, where are we going to go now?
Yeah, well, from here we can actually walking across this field, if it's possible, to Wadi Ravine. Now, Wadi Ravine is a very strongly defended German position. It's where the Germans brought in their men into the front line, and it's actually part of the memorial park for the Newfoundland Regiment at Beaumont, Hamel. So their memorial park, behind the German lines, we get Wadi Ravine. So we're looking at it from an odd point here, and it's well worth looking at it from the German perspective. So you're looking across the ravine and then into the memorial park. And it really shows you how deep this was. It was actually a chalk quarry. Wadi Ravine is a chalk quarry, and it's where the Germans really went underground. The Germans here, as we know, were underground everywhere. The underground positions, underground headquarters. And here they used the Wadi Ravine to get to their frontline trenches because it's already into the landscape. You can tunnel in from the base of it and then enter your trenches from tunnels. Of course, it saves enormous numbers of lives because they don't have to travel through trenches to get to the front line. They're coming in from underground. So Wadi Ravine is spectacular. It's well worth looking at. Very steep sides. We can't walk into it, and you can't even walk into it from the Memorial Park as well. If you're in the Memorial Park, you're not allowed into it either. But it's good to get a view into it from the German perspective. So yeah, it's a good way to end the tour.
Well, Pete, it's just been a wonderful journey. Thank you so much. I always enjoy getting out and exploring these Somme battlefields with you, Pete, because you just have a wonderful perspective on the sacrifice and the achievements that went on in this most important corner of the Somme. So I've really enjoyed it, Pete. Have you enjoyed this walk across the Somme battlefields?
Oh, fantastic! It's one of my favourite walks, and if you get the weather right, a feeling of a summer morning, then it's very, very moving. It's a very moving place to be.
I should mention as well that a year or two ago I made a video which is on YouTube available to download called Walking the Battle of the Somme, and it covers several of the sites that we've just discussed in this walk, including many others as well. But check that out on our YouTube video on the Living History YouTube page, Walking the Battle of the Somme, to see the Hawthorn Crater and some other famous sites. Pete, it's been wonderful. Until next time, thank you for joining me on the battlefields.
Pleasure, Matt. Enjoyable.